Sanval Nassim is Assistant Professor of Economics at LUMS. His primary research field is environmental and natural resource economics. His presentation, entitled Environmental Justice, What Do Economists Say?, will leverage the economics literature to discuss whether environmental regulations disproportionately affect marginalized groups, and whether policy tools such as cap and trade and carbon pricing can equitably allocate benefits across communities. Then we will hear from Ms. Medha Patkar, an Indian social activist working on various crucial political and economic issues raised by tribals, Dalits, farmers, laborers, and women facing injustice in India. She is the founder member of the 32-year-old people's movement called, and excuse my pronunciation, Narmada Bachao Andolan, NBA, in 3 states in India. She will be followed by Mr. Ahmed Rafi Alam, a Pakistani environmental lawyer and activist, and the founding partner of Salim Alam and Company, a firm that specializes in the energy, water, natural resources, and urban infrastructure sectors. His presentation, Climate Crisis and the Need for a Discourse from the Global South, an Activist Perspective, will show how the discourse surrounding the climate crisis in the global north has developed into clear lines of attack on greenhouse gas emissions and the countries and companies responsible for them, while it excludes voices speaking about the climate crisis from the global south. This presentation will address the need for an inclusive global discourse on the climate crisis and highlight the ways in which such a discourse can include voices of the poor, the marginalized, and the vulnerable. Our 4th speaker, Ms. Farhana Yamin, is an internationally recognized environmental lawyer, climate change policy expert, and activist, providing high-level strategic and legal advice to leaders of vulnerable countries. She is credited with getting the goal of net zero emissions by 2050 into the 2015 Paris Agreement, after which she founded Track Zero. In 2018, she joined Extinction Rebellion as coordinator of the political strategy team and played a central role in the rebellion, including getting arrested in April 2019 for gluing herself to the headquarters of the oil giant Shell. The Honorable Justice Syed Mansoor Ali Shah will close our panel. Justice Shah has served on the Pakistan Supreme Court since 2018, having previously served as Justice and then Chief Justice of the Lahore High Court. He taught law for almost 2 decades at LUMS, Punjab Law College, and the Pakistan College of Law in Lahore. Earlier this year, he even spoke to students in the Dignity Rights course that Professor May and I teach at Delaware Law School. To say he is a visionary doesn't begin to describe him because his vision is so broad and multidimensional. In addition to helping to found the law school at LUMS, he is responsible for the establishment of research centers, both at the Lahore High Court and at the Pakistan Supreme Court. He helped establish e-courts to broaden access to justice throughout the country, even before the pandemic forced everyone to work remotely. And he has spearheaded many other initiatives to improve the quality and speed of the dispensation of justice throughout the country. His judicial opinions on a range of issues, from women's rights to climate change to voting rights and more, push the law in new and extremely impactful ways. The common thread through much of this work is Justice Shah's commitment to advancing and protecting human dignity. So take a deep breath as we dive into what is sure to be an important and insightful discussion. We begin with Dr. Nassim, who brings us an economic perspective. Dr. Nassim, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Professor Aaron. I'm just going to share my screen here. The host will have to give me the option to share my screen. All right, perfect. So can you guys see my slides?
Yes.
You can. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So thank you. It's an honor to be part of this distinguished panel. There's been a slight I should have communicated this earlier, and I profusely apologize for that. But I thought since since the conference is hosted in Lahore and there's some sort of interesting work that we're doing around air pollution here. So I thought that perhaps sort of keeping the conversation kind of broad, I would first kind of give this sort of overview of the kind of economics literature on environmental justice and the new work that's being done, but then kind of hone in on some of my own work on air pollution information and investments in human capital to kind of ground the discussion in the local context. Before I get to sort of describing my own work, I just want to give you a sort of broad overview of how economists are kind of thinking about environmental justice these days. Again, focus. I think there's the title of the session has climate change in it, but a lot of what I'm going to be focusing on is essentially localized pollution. But the results or the analysis kind of generalizes to the broader issue of climate change. Traditionally, if you look at the kind of work economists have done vis-a-vis the environment, a lot of the focus has really been on finding cost-effective solutions to environmental regulations. So if you think about the Clean Air Act in the US, and then sort of the kind of rigorous standards that they enforce, and then this kind of debate and this transition towards prices or pricing environmental amenities and environmental services, etc. So the idea behind that sort of transition to this new kind of policy, the focus was predominantly on the fact that using price-based or incentive-based mechanisms are less costly compared to sort of traditional command and control policies like environmental standards. But now, in the last 5 years or so, or the last decade, as a matter of fact, the conversation that between economists is actually shifting, and they're no longer sort of really focused on efficiency or cost effectiveness. I mean, that's still part of the agenda, but the conversation has now has turned towards this idea of equity, right? So often, even if you look at theory, the idea that you can have incentive-based mechanisms, you can ensure cost effectiveness to some degree. So you can have environmental regulations at the lowest possible cost to society, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is going to be better off, right? There's going to be trade-offs. Certain individuals, communities, they're going to be worse off compared to others. But overall, in aggregate, you might achieve a certain kind of environmental standard or a goal at the lowest possible cost, but the impacts are going to be distributed across these kind of heterogeneous communities, right? So how do we really kind of, now that by itself is a problem, right? If low-income people or communities are affected to a greater degree compared to higher income areas or communities, if this impact differs across a race, ethnicity, these are important considerations. And so, we need to generate evidence or look at the evidence around how pollution disproportionately impacts different communities based on factors such as gender, race, ethnicity, etc. So now, there's evidence which shows that there's correlation between people who reside in low-income areas or areas with a high percentage of a certain race and the siting of polluting facilities, right? So predominantly, if you look at the US, there's suggestive evidence which shows that low-income areas or areas where you have a high percentage of African-American communities, those areas are where you see a high percentage of polluting facilities like hazardous dump sites or polluting firms. Now, so this is so these are basically correlations, and economists are kind of focused on figuring out what are some of the sort of causal reasons for this reasons for observing this correlation. So one of the arguments is, and there's evidence for this, causal evidence for this, that there's income inequality leads to selection. So to move into less polluting neighborhoods, or less polluted neighborhoods, those neighborhoods tend to be housing prices, residential prices there tend to be higher, and so low-income individuals will then self-select into areas where residential prices are lower, but are also the ambient air quality there is poorer than the other neighborhoods. Another reason is sort of direct discrimination by firms or governments, right? So there's some evidence here to suggest that local governments or firms are going to deliberately focus on areas or discriminate against communities based on race or ethnicity. Another sort of economic reason, and there's again causal evidence for this, is that firms locate, and this is purely kind of a sort of conventional economic argument, that firms are going to locate in areas where costs to the firms, and these include things like transportation, setting up industrial sites in the first place, the low costs, low regulatory costs, but also low political costs, right? So you can think about areas where communities have high political power. They're able to get greater or sort of they tend to demand greater environmental compliance. But areas where costs, so not just economic costs to the firms, but also areas where you have low political power, are areas so firms tend to locate there because the costs tend to be lower there, right? And then Katie Hausman at the University of Chicago, at the University of Michigan, has this new paper out currently at the NBR, where she kind of argues, her and a co-author basically argue that there's another source, causal source for why pollution disproportionately impacts certain communities over others, and that is information failures. So there's certain groups of people who don't tend to have enough information on the impacts of pollution or where pollution is most concentrated, and then they end up, again, sorting into polluted neighborhoods as a result. So this is kind of like a very broad overview of kind of like the current economics literature on the impacts of pollution, or the disproportionate impacts of pollution. I'm going to now focus on sort of shift direction and focus on Lahore and my own work, my co-authored work, which has to do with pollution information provision and investments in human capital. And this is an experiment that we ran in Lahore, focused on a low to middle income neighborhood, so what we consider sort of an average Lahori. And we're trying to then understand how much does an average Lahori actually value air pollution information? How much do they value pollution avoidance? And these are things they don't have access to. And if they do value these things, what are the sort of welfare gains of increasing access to this kind of pollution avoidance to an average sort of citizen or an individual in Lahore? And then, of course, our results generalize to a larger set of developing countries. All right. So the context is that we're focused on Lahore, Pakistan. Lahore is has consistently ranked amongst one of the most polluted cities in the world. But the fascinating thing is that if you look at the history of air pollution management in the city, this is the air pollution regulation is now part is something that the provinces actually look at since the devolution of powers to the provinces under the 18th Amendment to our Constitution. But even before these powers were devolved to the provinces, there's been if you look at sort of the citizen-led initiatives, people have been out there trying to get like the government to really kind of enforce its regulations, right? So if you look at the regulatory setup in Punjab, it is kind of strong, You have a set of environmental emission standards. You have protocols on how those emission standards are going to be applied. And those have been strengthened over the course of the last 20 years through writ petitions and through suo motu notices by our courts, suo motu notices taken in the interest of, in the public interest. One of the panelists here is Justice Syed Mansoor Ali Shah, who in a private capacity, I believe, filed a writ petition in 2003, which was taken by the court. And then the Lahore High Court basically directed environmental authorities to actually operationalize some of the recommendations that came out of that. And then in his capacity as the Lahore High Court Chief Justice, he constituted a commission that looked into the sources of smog. And then, there's a very comprehensive list of recommendations that the Smog Commission in Lahore actually produced. And the courts directed the regulator and the Punjab government to actually operationalize those recommendations. Now, the fact is that we do have, on paper at least, a robust set of regulations and rules and processes to implement them, right? But if you look at the enforcement and monitoring, that to this day is incredibly weak. And so, Lahore ends up being, part of this sort of exclusive club, of one of the most polluted cities in the world. And that has serious repercussions, right? So if you look at exposure, now this is PM 2.5, one of the most egregious pollutants in Lahore's air. This is a trend of PM 2.5 concentrations in Lahore over the course from May 2019 to May 2020. If you look at this figure, the green line basically is it's a reference line showing the EPD's own standard, which is 35 micrograms per meter cube. This is our regulators mandated a daily standard for PM 2.5. And the red line basically is the WHO's recommended standard for PM 2.5. And so this trend, if you look at it, is basically saying you can, most days out of this 1 year, Lahore's pollution was way above these. Well, on certain days it was just above the EPD's own standard, and in most days was well above the recommended and the established standard in the province. So there's a host of literature that shows, or quantifies the impact of exposure to PM 2.5 on health outcomes and financial outcomes. Here, what I'm showing you is the Air Quality Life Index, which the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago has produced. So this is, Professor Michael Greenstone's work at U Chicago. So this is basically, they use causal kind of links between PM 2.5 and health to come up with estimates of life expectancy. And essentially what they're saying is, if you look at a city like Lahore, if you were to decrease, if you were to bring average PM 2.5 levels to the WHO guideline for the year, then an average Lahori can live 5.3 years longer than they do currently. And if you bring it to the national standard, which is 15 micrograms per meter cube, this is the annual standard, then an average Lahori can live 4.8 years longer. Right? So this is a lot of years, and hence there's this exposure to PM 2.5 has serious sort of repercussions and impacts, which largely are being ignored if you focus on the lack of enforcement and monitoring of our environmental regulations. All right, so what do? So we basically were trying to understand, given the sort of broad, this context of poor air quality in Lahore and exposure, we were trying to understand how much people, if you go into an average neighborhood where people basically, their income level, if you look at the income level, they're just slightly higher than the national average. in those neighborhoods, how do people kind of perceive air pollution? Do they know anything about it? Do they know how to avoid air pollution or take necessary steps or engage in certain kinds of behaviors that would lead to less exposure to PM 2.5? And so this is how we generated sort of this baseline data on how an average Lahori kind of interacts with this externality. So it seems that when we collected this baseline data, roughly 77% of the sample, they were concerned about the effects of pollution on their quality of life. So they, because in the winter months, there's just you can visibly kind of see smog, right? Now, and then in the summer, even though PM 2.5 levels tend to be very high in the summer months as well, as that trend showed you, it's not as visible as in the winter months, but people do pick up on that, right? So they know that their air is polluted, and they can, there's sort of tangible measures or tangible ways that it affects them. So they tend to really sort of, on average, people do see this as a detriment to their quality of life. And they also believed, that it causes a loss in their productivity, though they weren't able to precisely kind of give us, quantify exactly how much their productivity is affected. But as a qualitative measure, sort of a crude qualitative measure, they said that exposure to pollution does affect their productivity. The things that they aren't able to do is, for example, this is avoidance behavior, right? They know they're being exposed to pollution, but they're not engaging in behavior like rescheduling activities. I haven't shown the bar for mosques, but a lot of them don't know what, or at baseline, they know what air particulate filtering masks are, specialized masks that filter out PM 2.5. Plus, they're not able to forecast pollution well, right? So they know that pollution affects them and it affects their quality of life and their productivity, but they really just don't have that information to kind of get a sense of how to avoid pollution and what are the different ways that they can sort of forecast what pollution is going to look like and then engage in appropriate kind of behavior as a response to it. All right, so we went in and we conducted a RC. So we collected this baseline data, and then we did this experiment where we basically randomly assigned our sample of how we had roughly 1,100 households into a pure control group, and we didn't do anything with folks in this group. But in the treatment group, basically, we gave a random sample of people access to daily forecasts of PM 2.5 levels through SMS messages. So this was an SMS forecast service. This is free of cost. Every day at 8 p.m., households in this group would basically get an SMS that provided them a forecast for the next day's PM 2.5 levels. And it also gave them information on the previous day's realized PM 2.5 levels. And that was so that they get a good sense of whether we were giving them trustworthy information or not. Our pollution forecasts were relatively very accurate, and folks were able to kind of judge that too by comparing our forecasts to the actual realized value. And the other training group, in the other sort of treatment group, basically, or again, a random sample, we assigned people a forecast, we assigned people to a forecast training. And this was a training where we went into the field and we trained people to become better forecasters. So think of this as an educational kind of training, very brief. This was about an hour long. And so there's this work by Philip Tetlock at the University of Pennsylvania. And Philip Tetlock basically argues that, people are, there are cognitive biases that can affect the way people actually forecast. And by tweaking these biases and by kind of, learning certain kinds of methods and rules, one can actually improve their forecasting ability. And that helps, right? If you're able to forecast pollution, let's say, which is what we're trying to do here, then you can buffer shocks better. You can plan a day ahead. You can minimize your exposure to pollution outdoors. You can see whether you want to, if you forecast that it's a incredibly polluted day, perhaps you won't sort of send your kid to school, or you will go and buy a particular filtering mask so that you're equipped to kind of minimize your exposure to pollution. So there's a lot of welfare effects, but plausible welfare effects of actually being able to forecast forecast pollution levels. And the third treatment arm was basically, the folks got the training and this SMS service. All right, so this is just a sort of overview of the interventions. On the left, you see is the SMS message that folks in our group received. It basically gives them the forecast and then the actual realized value of PM2.5 levels from T-1, which is a day before. On the right, you see is a picture of the cover of our training pamphlet. So this was the rules for how to become a better forecaster. And so, people in the field kind of receive this 1 hour training and learn how to minimize these cognitive biases so that they can produce better forecasts. All right, so here are the results. Now, what I'm showing you right now is a distribution of what we call the willingness to pay for our air pollution forecast service. And what this shows is that, so the average level, so we went in and we basically, once people were treated, we went back to the households and we collected this N-line data. And at N-line, we basically asked folks how much they're willing to pay, since they've been receiving this SMS service, how much are they willing to pay for this service if they ever got a chance, right? So this is different from like observed prices in the market. This is actually people stating the maximum they are actually willing to pay to receive something, right? So just you have to take care of that. The prices aren't necessarily the maximum willingness to pay for something. It is a reflection of how much people do value goods. But in this case, we were able to kind of get them to reveal to us the maximum they were willing to pay for the service. And this is basically, a reflection of how much they value a thing. So the maximum they're willing to pay, again, through the sort of economic jargon, is the maximum willing to pay is a reflection of the value people place on these kind of products and services. And what we see is that an average, the average person in our sample is willing to pay up to about roughly 90 rupees to continue receiving the service for another 3 months. And that is almost as much as the cost of a mobile internet data, a month-long mobile internet data. So this is, and this is just for one person. And if you aggregate this across the city, this comes to roughly $16 million. And so that is the amount of value people in the city are placed on, in aggregate, placing on air pollution information. In this case, forecast. But this is, this is very valuable kind of evidence, right? That people actually value this sort of information, and this allows them. And one of the reasons why they value this is because it allows them to avoid the harmful impact of exposure to PM2.5. Here's another set of results. I'll just quickly explain these. So beyond measuring how much people were willing to pay for the forecasting service, we try to look at whether receiving the forecasting service increased their willingness to pay for particular filtering masks, right? So what we see is that people who actually receive the air pollution forecast are also willing to pay going to the market and procure the PM2.5 particulate masks, right? What we call the N95 masks. So there is this spillover effect, essentially, that not only are people getting this information, but and they value this information, but as a result, the people also value things that kind of protect their health, right? People value these masks. And, on average, they're willing to pay as much as 77% of the retail price of this mask. So again, what this is suggesting is 77% is a lot. And so small subsidies, and so these don't even have to be that drastic, can actually shift that distribution so that a larger share of people are then able to go into the market and then procure these filtering masks and avoid pollution, right? And then we also demonstrated that in our findings, we see that people who receive the SMS messages and get the training, they at the end they're able to forecast air pollution or minimize their forecast errors, so they become good forecasters of air pollution. And this result is stronger for those people who receive the training. And the fact is that we trained them in the summer, and we went and elicited this kind of forecast error 6 months later. And what we see is that even 6 months after the training, people are able to retain that information, that sort of the training information that we gave them, those rules of like minimizing cognitive biases, able to recall those and forecast pollution better, right? So this was a durable effect. So this investment in human capital to be able to kind of become a better forecaster has this sort of durable effect and leads people to engage in this avoidance behavior, which has welfare effects. All right, so I'll conclude, and I just want to kind of focus on these 3 takeaways. So the 3 takeaways are, so there's one which is related to the study itself, and which is essentially that, people have a right to clean air, and they should, and that's enshrined in our Constitution as far as as I know. But that's on the mitigation side. On the avoidance side, the problem is that there is a lot of inequality in terms of how what the access to avoidance, inequality in access to avoidance. So richer households are able to kind of afford air purifiers. They also have access to better information. They can access this information through their apps, through social media, etc. But your average Lahori doesn't necessarily have access to this kind of information, right? Or these kind of avoidance products. So you can achieve those, large welfare gains by increasing access to these. And then I'll just end by, since I guess I'm over my 20-minute the period allotted to me, just focus on saying that it's the fact that Lahore has, or Punjab has, a strong regulatory apparatus on paper, but we're still seeing really terrible levels of air pollution, sort of is signals that we really need to understand what are the political economy constraints that are leading to these regulatory failures. And I am now sort of convinced that unless we address these kind of political economy constraints, we're going to continue to see these regulatory failures, even though we might have a strong system, or we claim that we have a strong system enshrined in our rules and regulations. Right, thank you. I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nassim, for that incredibly interesting economic analysis that really gives us a lot of insight into how people think about pollution and what we can do to improve people's quality of life. So thank you very much for that. Next, we're going to hear from Ms. Mehta Patkar, who's going to tell us more about her experiences in the communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have this dialogue with the students, friends, and faculty members of LUMS and the Office of Accessibility and Inclusion has really drawn on various critical issues which are threatening our life itself. No doubt, COVID pandemic is now grappling all our senses, intellects, and our actions. But I must say that the climate change is a worse virus that is going to again kill not just the nature or the climate that is humane, but also the life itself. And hence, the issue of right to life, which includes right to livelihood, right to shelter, right to education, right to health, and right to live with dignity. That is something that is under threat. And hence, it is necessary to understand the causes behind these threatening that is faced and who is facing the worst. It is very clear that the climate change is discussion and agreements at the national and international levels. And many action plans are produced and put forth as the solution before the societies at large. In South Asia, when we talk about Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and other countries, we know that the population is considering itself to be citizenry and voter citizens of democracies. And yet, we know that we are facing exclusion as far as 90 to 95% of our working class population itself, beyond doubt. And that exclusion is also caused by the climate change. But the climate change itself is caused by the various kinds of inequities and injustice. That includes economic, social, and political inequities and injustice as well. So, what is climate change? The whole fearful and formidable future that lies in front of us is not even told to and reached out to the population sections which are facing the worst of its impact. It is known to the people from Pakistan that the Indus is also affected. And it is not just Indus, but almost every river, whether it is Narmada, where our struggle is on for last more than 35 years. And we have saved people from displacement without rehabilitation. But we cannot resettle and rehabilitate a river which dies as a result of various kinds of assaults upon it. And that is what is happening to many, many rivers. We know that the rivers like Indus, which are getting its water flows through the ice melting, is facing the worst because the ice melting itself is grown beyond limits. And what was happening till 99 or say 2000, it is now changed completely. The net loss that used to be counted in terms of the ice or the snow that is received on the earth and something which is lost due to melting. Net loss was calculated to be 800 tons uh, till few years ago. Now that balance is lost. And when this happens, that the melting takes place beyond limits, and also the rainfall comes due to the rising temperature. Uh, with the same water flow coming down on the earth, but within the shortest possible time, then the causal effect is the flood. And this and the flood and droughts, the rivers flowing and flowing, but the riverine populations, you know that the agriculture that gives food security in to the population in Pakistan also is much dependent on the populations which are cultivating on the banks and in the valley of Indus. Same is in India. It is the valley of Ganges, which is 80% of our productive agricultural valley and resource matrix. but now everything is affected due to this flood and drought cycle. And who gets affected then? It is the agriculture and the agriculturists. You know that in India today, for last 6 months and more, during which not less than 400 martyrs have lost their lives, the farmers' movement is on. And this movement also is wanting to save the natural resources with the rights. So when you talk about dignity rights, it is the right to life with dignity that comes as the first right that every human being is born with, not granted or out to. And hence, we understand that the various communities living on the natural resources and the human resources, which are complementary to the natural resources, whether it is land, water, forest, fish, and so on, they are the ones who are affected in the worst possible manner. Now, why does this happen? This is because when the summits are taking place at the international level, it is from the same sources that the capital is flowing and flowing into all of our South Asian countries. And that comes also through the international financial institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions onwards, beyond the World Bank and IMF. Today, there are an umpteen number of bilateral agencies and umpteen number of multinational agencies that are bringing in not just investment, but interference and intervention into the policy making and law making of our countries. And when we are facing the impacts of the climate change, we want to save our natural resources. This kind of financial inputs and relatedly the changes in the laws and policies are pushing us towards exactly the opposite direction and the manzil. वो मंजिल क्या है? वो मंजिल है corporatization की. That is the goal that the corporatization policies are trying to achieve. It is the goal of vulgar inequity that would benefit a handful of population that would enjoy life, that would ensure their livelihood beyond generations, and that would have free and freedom and to live with dignity, but not the others. And this is related to the development paradigm. The paradigm that is followed in the name of development, which, as I just said, is being promoted and pushed through the capital investors of one kind. And they are not just ignoring or neglecting, but they are kicking out the populations who are investing the natural resource capital and the human resource capital. This discrimination and this disparity is something that causes the climate change. So it is certain elite sections that are creating the carbon emissions, that are leading to pollution, which just another panelist talked about, and that is not bothered about the impact of the long-term kind, because they believe that it is money and market that will save them forever, and that will ensure that they get all fundamental basic rights to life, livelihood, shelter, education, health, etc. But their life is also not safe and secure. But the immediate impact is on whom? It is on the riverine population, as I told you. It is also on the sea coastal populations. Remember that the countries like Bangladesh, which is a delta region, that faces huge impact due to the the sea ingress. Although sea ingress is happening across the world, but certain countries where even little bit of sea ingress due to the rise in the sea level, which is due to climate change, rising temperatures, they face huge impact compared to others. Now, this is of different kinds of impacts that are caused due to the carbon emissions. And this emission is also due to our activities with the so-called natural gas and the oil extraction. And that in turn is related to the energy intensive technologies and energy intensive lifestyles. And all of this is pushing us into a vicious cycle, which can be irreversible. And mind you, friends, therefore, unless we get awakened and we also awaken the people at large, we will not save humankind. And that will be the worst impact of the worst kind of virus beyond COVID pandemic. Now, which population gets affected to the worst extent? I was saying that it is the natural resource and human resource based communities. But that is a vague statement, maybe. We have to see how the so-called poverty is imposed upon the certain sections who are the real contributors to our economy, to our life, to our amenities, to our comforts. And that includes the urban poor population as an example, if we take that. We know that the slums in Mumbai, the financial capital of India, habitat 60% of the Mumbai's population. Now, this percentage can differ to Lahore, to Delhi, to Calcutta, to Dhaka, and so on. But it is generally in the metropolis and megalopolis that 25% to 60% of population live in the shanty towns and slums, which are the so-called poor localities. In fact, they are rich in their resources. Their resources are manual labor resources. Their resources are of skills, and they contribute huge extent to the building, construction, production, distribution, and so on. But remember this climate change, which is bringing in not just heat, but also humidity. And then the heat index, which considers not just heat, but also the heat and humidity together, they really face death, not just squalor in their habitats. Now, this is not even counted. No one who is working hard is understanding the real impacts of the climate change. So it is necessary for us to bring out and expose the changes that are occurring to the natural resources. And it is also necessary to understand that we have to really save and protect the life from these changes and their impacts. Am I audible, friends?
Yes, you are. We can't.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. We can't see your video, but we can hear you.
Am I audible?
Yes, you can keep talking because we've heard everything. But we just can't see your video.
Can I continue? Sure. Okay, doesn't matter.
Please continue.
Audio is important.
Yes.
I think so. That is why we must see that this is affecting the urban poor the most. And urbanization and industrialization, which is considered as the indicators of development, are the causes of much of the climate change. It is because of the lifestyle, it is because of the centralization of not just services, but also resource matrices and so on. And that really is linked to the development paradigm, which is unsustainable and unjust. The rural populations who lived their lives with enough of oxygen is also now compelled to search and fight for oxygen, while the free giving oxygen was coming from the tree cover, the green cover that covered not just earth, but protected our life from heat and from carbon emissions, they are killed. And these resources being destroyed, there is not just pollution, but also degeneration, degradation of forest, of tree cover. And then what happens is seen that we have to rush for ventilators, we have to rush for concentrators that also get oxygen from the air and nowhere else, not from the machines per se. And then the corporate world, which from where the capital flows into the development paradigm I just referred to, which in turn leads to climate change. That corporate world benefits from all kinds of crises that we face, whether they are cyclones, like the Amphan cyclone that affected West Bengal, with more than 1.5 million houses getting destroyed. How does the corporate world see this? All those who become shelterless rush to the cities and work for the capitalists, for not just building and construction, but all kinds of services with inhuman and below subsistence level economies of their own, while they fill the pockets and exchequers of the big investors, the vulgarly rich populations. So this is how the things are linked. And in India, if you just see how much is this corporatization creating inequity, are the companies, sorry, these, can you hear me?
Yes, please continue.
You can just take two examples of two companies, Adani's and Ambani's. You know that it was for Adani's that our dear Prime Minister visited Pakistan and met Nawaz Sharif with a Najrana. That was not with love and affection, because he and his party in power has been condemning, criticizing Pakistan, while we feel friendly with our brethren and sisters in Pakistan, and we are together. But he went there only to bring in the market for Adani's power generation. Now, this kind of company, Adani, is earning as one single owner how much of income per day? It is more than 3,000 million rupees per day. And another one, Ambani, one of the two brothers, is earning more than 10,000 million rupees per day. While 10,000 rupees cannot even be a bank balance in any laborer's bank account, even at the end of life or at the time of retirement. So when you talk of the impacts are on the labor rights, the impacts are on the right to livelihood, and impact is also on the right to equity and right to justice. Now this, therefore, what is necessary to understand is that we have to have security of every kind. And that is not only for the population which works hard, it is for every human being. So take the cause of food security. There also the corporate entry is really bringing in further disparity, and also finishing off the schemes like the public distribution scheme that supports a large number of population in each of the South Asian countries. But take the example of India. The hoarding and stocking by the corporates is now permitted, even related to the agro products, while those were the essential commodities since 1955 enactment that was brought into the independent India. But now this government in power is amending that and not considering food as essential commodity. Such a distorted and perverted vision of security really gives rise to indignity and undignified life. This is going to happen soon in India, that the public distribution system, which provides at least small support in terms of food grains to the individuals who are below poverty line, although those calculations are false and many still remain deprived, but still that is some support. But even that is going to be finished. So with the climate change on one hand, and these populations getting affected with their livelihoods getting lost, whether they are fish workers whose change in the river flows is bringing in change in the fishing productions as well. So the aquatic wealth and natural wealth is affected, but they will not even get food security through such systems, because the corporatization and privatization doesn't want the state, the omnipotent state, to support these populations. On the other hand, they support the corporates. And that's why the elite populations are not worried about the climate change. They don't have to worry about anything. They can get everything with money and market. And that is not what the rest of the country can afford. It is necessary, therefore, that we need to change the development paradigm if we need to have our right to live with dignity. We need to change the paradigm towards, in the power sector, renewable sources of energy. In India kind of country, 60% of our power is coming from the thermal sector. We must change this. But then the coal blocks are being granted to the private investors, and they will go on without any regulatory mechanism. As it was talked in the context of pollution, this will increase. And that's why the laws are changed to deregulate the mechanisms and processes that would control the impacts of climate change, and that would really give rise to the right kind of choice of technology and also choice of pace in every sector. If it is the corporates, it is profit over people. So they will never check the pace of their production or extraction and the destruction. We need to change this. We need to bring in regulatory mechanisms. How will that mechanism function? When the governments have become, the rulers have become partners of the corporates, they themselves have become investors in many, many sectors, not just coal extraction, not just power, in water management, in waterways kind of projects, in education and health, where they are looting the common people, even in the context of COVID pandemic. I will not be able to deal with each of these sectors, but there is so much to talk about it. I would only say that we therefore need the regulation and monitoring about the choice of technology, choice of development projects, choice of goals and the vision itself by people at large, and not just through the departments and the ministries that really compromise and always link themselves and support the corporates whenever there is impact. The impact on the food security is also because the agricultural production is affected by climate change. The quantity and quality of food crops is getting affected when the temperature rises. And imagine how the agriculturists who are already facing losses and committing suicides. I do not have the figures from Pakistan, but in India, every few minutes, 20 minutes to 30 minutes, one farmer commits suicide. And the martyrdom is faced, therefore, by the people's movement, which is the farmers' movement, farm laborers' movement.
I think we're going to have to end it there.
Understand. It is therefore necessary to understand.
Thank you.
Thank you. We need to have the population and planning from the bottom up. So the community-based monitoring.
Thank you. I think
only will bring in the true democratic development paradigm. Dwell on that point, last point, that when we have discriminations of various kinds.
I wonder if we can save the last point for the discussion.
Due to caste.
Could we save the last point for the discussion? So we'll have some time at the end to have a broader discussion. So,
I will conclude this by saying that the Dalits, Adivasis, the indigenous people, and women and children are the worst affected. So I will say that if these discriminations are also to be dealt with, because these are the populations which face cumulative inequity and cumulative impact of climate change, and it is the change in economic climate, it is change in social climate, it is change in political climate, that is also change in the geological climate. But it's therefore necessary that we have the people's movements which bring in that kind of homogeneous struggling population force, and that is the real democratic force that can change whatever we want to change, the climate change of every kind, and then save our life and livelihood. Otherwise, the compensation for the losses is not going to come through. And thank you very much. I expect all of you to become activists, not just academicians, and join people's movements or support people's movements. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You are so inspirational. I'm sure that many of us will become even more active after hearing your talks, and we will have time, we hope, at the end for discussion to continue these talks. So thank you so much for that. Next, we're going to hear from Rafi Alam, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about these themes from a Global South perspective. So Rafi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Erin, and thank you very much, LUMS Office of Accessibility and Inclusion, for inviting me to this very interesting discussion and giving me an opportunity to not only think about it, but also share some thoughts as well. Of course, we live in strange times. This last year has been a disruption in everyone's life and even the global economic system to some extent. And as much as our lives have changed and are changed today, one reflection of it being that we're having this conference on Zoom, let's not forget that the COVID pandemic pales in comparison to what we are facing and are going to face in terms of the climate crisis. One of the ways we measure how bad the climate crisis is by numbering or counting the, excuse me, can someone turn their phone off, please? Is by counting the carbon concentration in the atmosphere. This is a chart of carbon concentration in the atmosphere, and the Manu Lao Observatory in Hawaii last week posted that we have crossed 420 parts per million of carbon concentration. You have to go back, according to this logarithmic chart, well over 5 or 10 million years to be able to find a point in human history where that's been a similar level of carbon concentration. For context, that period of time is far outside the 1.5 million years Homo sapiens and human civilization has existed on the face of the earth. The last time carbon concentrations were that high, there was a global extinction event. One of the manifestations of increased carbon concentrations is, of course, global warming. We are, as of today, 1.2 degrees on average warmer than we were at the pre-industrial level. And I must also say there is no such thing as safe amounts of global warming. At 1.2 degrees of temperature, we're seeing devastating forest fires in California. We've seen horrific images of forest fires in early 2020 from Australia, where at least 800 million animals lost their lives unable to escape the flames. There is plastic in the oceans. Their oceans are acidifying. Our coral reefs are bleaching. We are facing a global extinction event today, and there is plastic in our bodies. But I want to we've seen these pictures of what the climate crisis looks like, the apocalypse around the world. I want to focus a little bit and show you what it looks like here in Pakistan. In April 2018, there was an unseasonal rain over Punjab, which actually cost a substantial amount of wheat production. And although there was some political disruption in wheat supplies the following year, Pakistan did face a wheat shortage on account of this one climate event. Not only was there a shortage of wheat, which is a staple crop, but livelihoods of tens of thousands of farmers was affected throughout the province through one day's rain. About 10 years ago, 1 week of heat waves in Karachi cost the city 1,400 lives. And as temperatures increase, I'm afraid this is going to be the circumstance in many of our cities, which, because of the urban heat island effect, are unprepared to provide the poor and those without access to electricity or air conditioning the protection they need from the ovens that they're living in. Even though Punjab and Pakistan are not a heavily industrialized economy, Lahore has some of the dirtiest air pollution in the world. Most air pollution is, of course, greenhouse gases. And as Samuel explained, we're losing as much as 5 years of our life on account of this economic activity taking place in Pakistan's second capital. Last year, a national emergency was declared because of an attack of locusts. And you have to understand that these locust attacks are as much connected to climate change as the forest fires in Australia and the Arctic Circle that we hear about. It's been 3 or 4 years of unseasonably wet winters that allow locust populations to continue to increase and become this plague phenomenon that we saw devastate lands and farms from the Horn of Africa into Bihar in India. And last year in July, 2 days of rain in Karachi brought the commercial capital of Pakistan to a standstill for 2 weeks, causing immeasurable amount of loss, not only to property, but also to lives. But here I want to take my first observation about dignity and climate change, because the flooding that took place in Karachi wasn't just the 2 days of 1 in 100 year event, climate event of rain. It's also been the urban development of Karachi in the past few decades. Land reclamation, mostly for urban elite areas, you'll see on the bottom right-hand side of this map, have changed the actual landscape of Karachi. And on the bottom left-hand side, you can see encroachments into natural estuaries that used to drain the city. These constructions, most of which are populated by the urban poor, have been reacted against on account of the flooding, and we're beginning to see urban demolitions trying to clean these drains. Article 14(1) of the Pakistani Constitution says that the dignity of man and subject to law, the privacy of home shall be inviolable. Here we are seeing demolitions and evictions to clean a drain on account of a climate event that happened a year ago. And we're beginning to see political protests and social movements calling this the Gujar Nala climate event. The international response to increasing greenhouse gases and the climate crisis was formulated in 1992 with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which sought to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions. And that stabilization has manifested itself with the Kyoto Protocol's ambition of keeping global warming to 2 degrees centigrade and the Paris Agreement's more ambitious target of trying to keep it to 1.5 degrees. Unfortunately, we have produced more greenhouse gases since the UNFCCC, since we have done historically before. In other words, the international agreement has failed. It has failed to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions, and we have currently put enough greenhouse gases into the atmosphere to lock in a 2 to 2.5 degree temperature increase by the middle of next decade. Putting this into context, you have to understand that after 2 or 3 degrees of global warming, we will face devastating food shortages on account of the fact that there aren't any seeds or trees currently alive that are capable from an evolutionary point of view to withstand the heat increase that we have already cooked into the system. Beyond 4 degrees, it is indescribable, absolutely indescribable what will happen to this earth. The difference, I'll just point out, between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of warming, the ambitions of Kyoto and Paris, have been IPCC certified to be at least 150 million deaths, mostly in Asian and African countries on account of the air pollution associated with economic and transport activity. 140 million people is 4 times the number of people who were killed in World War I and World War II put together. And we're facing that temperature increase in the next 15 years. It is a full-on, full-blown climate crisis for which, if we want to envision what type of greenhouse gas reduction strategies we need, we see this type of ambition, the type of reduction that, quite frankly, with our use of simple things like mobile phones and our habits, seems impossible to achieve right now. I'm always asked what we can do about the climate crisis. And I'm going to try and summarize it, even though Meda Patkar madam was very, very eloquent in her critique of the system. But I believe that there are 5 systems that drive the climate crisis. And let me explain them. It's capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, consumerism, and the fossil fuel economy. Before you accuse me of being a socialist or a feminist, let me explain these terms in a climate setting. Capitalism is an economic system that allows the unaccountable manipulation and abuse of natural resources and labor, incidentally. And it's capitalism that allows this accumulation and these sorts of anomalies, like this newspaper headline that identifies only 90 companies responsible for 2/3 of historical greenhouse gas emissions. To think that so few people have stood and made an immeasurable amount of money, fully knowing the devastation that their economic processes has caused, is one of the flaws of this economic system. We need to replace this with an economic system that provides accountability for the manipulation and consumption of resources and of labor. And the same is true with patriarchy, which is a system that puts the man in the middle of all economic decision-making, creating an asymmetric imbalance against women in all spheres of life. But remember, it is an economic system tied to the consumption of resources and labor. Colonialism, settler colonialism, and the history of that is very, very simple. Pakistan and India have been subject to this as well. And part of the environmental damages we have are on account of colonial legislation that don't protect natural resources, but actually treat natural resources as extractive resources that can be used and consumed consistently. Consumerism is another thing that I would like to speak about, but let me just stop here and say that right now in Pakistan, and this is another anomaly that the capitalist system throws up. Right now in Pakistan, and this was a report that was published on the Thar coal fields in April of last year. It's an international collaboration of researchers in India and Pakistan on what the health impacts are going to be of putting up the Thar coal power sector. But in that report, they point out that across the board, renewable energy tariffs in Pakistan, that is wind and solar, are cheaper than all other types of electricity, including hydel and coal. And so right now, not only is renewable electricity environmentally friendly, but it's also financially sensible and sustainable, which raises the question why Pakistan continues to execute long-term fossil fuel energy contracts in the presence of alternatives that are cheaper and that are safer for climate change. Consumerism, which is our habit of consuming things, has to be understood as well, because I think this is another point of dignity that comes up. You see, human beings don't consume resources equally. And as this chart shows, the minority elite, about 10% of the population, the richest in the world, are responsible for consuming over 50% of the resources of this earth. Therefore, saying that, for example, a population increase per se, or the human population as it is now on the earth, is the cause of climate change, is actually to put the blame of climate change on those poor people who do not consume resources like the billionaires who fly their private jets and have their private yachts. We have to address this type of consumerism as well, because climate change affects people on a scale of affluence. The poorer you are, the more vulnerable you are. And that's why Pakistan is one of the more vulnerable countries to climate change, because we're a poor country. And lastly, to conclude, I'm always asked what we're going to need. And I could spend all day trying to explain these things, but in a world where basic civilization is actually coming undone, where scarce resources and climate change are causing political uncertainty around the world, and we're beginning to see that political uncertainty respond by this increase in these strong men that we see around the world, these tyrants and anti-democratic leaders all over in the United States, in Turkey, in India, in China, elsewhere, that are anti-democratic. The system can't hold anymore, and we're beginning to see these tyrants emerge. These systems were put in place to protect human civilization, to protect our dignity. And as these systems begin to collapse, we have to understand that the one thing that's going to save us is our ability to empathize and identify the humanity in other individuals. We can't lose sight of that. That is the basis of society and the basis of civilization going forward. And we need nurturing relationships to be able to do that. Thank you very much for your time and for this opportunity for letting me speak.
Thank you. That was so interesting, and you left us with a lot to think about, I think. Next, we're going to hear from Farhana Yamin. Welcome, Farhana.
Hi there. Can you hear and see me okay, Erin?
Yes, perfect.
Great, great, great. Well, thank you so much. And I'm very grateful to the previous three speakers who have spoken with so much knowledge and insight and with such passion. And I hope that I can add to what they've said. I largely agree with all of their comments and the knowledge that they've shared. We know that climate change, as far as climate change is an outcome of multiple crises that were already unfolding. It's a consequence of the extractivist consumer economy, which has its roots, going far back 400 years ago in an Enlightenment mindset. It has its roots in the rapid industrialization based on fossil fuels, coal primarily, but also the extraction and use of the resources of the global south, what we now call the global south. So it's tied intimately with the expansionist settler project, the project of imperialism, racism, and colonialism. And our world is very much still shaped by that. It's shaped by those realities. And I'm afraid that the climate treaties, which I've been involved in, I've been to more COPs in the UK than anyone else, including the preparations for the very first COP in 1995 in Berlin, when my first child, who's now 26, was just 6 months old. So I've literally aged as a mother, as a professional in that time, and I've only missed 2 COPs. And I'll use my 15 minutes or so, because I'd really love to have some discussion and to hear from the floor and the participants, whether it's through the chat channels or otherwise, about what their hopes, aspirations, and what their take is now on this global moment that we have in the run up to the climate change COP, another COP, a big UN summit, following on from the Paris Agreement, which was in 2015, which is coming up in Glasgow in November 2021, just sort of 6 months or so now. And this last year obviously is compressed, but it was meant to be, and it still is, the super year for environment development and the UN system. We have a confluence of many different mega events relating to the biodiversity COP, relating to the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, relating to the development aid packages. So even before COVID struck, this was meant to be a fundamental realignment, wake up, and a moment for ambition to really show itself across all of those fronts, and to bring the crisis of nature, of biodiversity loss, which has been ongoing for hundreds of years and has accelerated dramatically in the last 50 years, the crisis of extractivism, with resources, whether it's coal, minerals, whether it's timber, gold, precious resources like fisheries, or you name it, all of those are depleted and at major tipping points, if indeed those haven't been lost already. So the UN system across the whole, civil society across the whole, was meant to push for, unite, and increase rapidly the pace of action across many fronts. I have been involved in the negotiations. I'm going to hold them up. I'll never go anywhere without them. All of the three treaties, actually, the Climate Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and then the final Paris Agreement. Each one has taken roughly a decade to get from the demands for further rounds of action to a mandate, a legal mandate for that round to happen, to the negotiations, which usually, so literally over my 33 years now, since starting as a as a lawyer and a campaigner, I have helped birth 3 different international treaties. And I don't agree with Rafe. I don't think that they have failed. I have joined protest movements, as Erin said, and see absolutely that the kind of radical, community-based grassroots movement that Medha has spoken so passionately about and been involved in, we all need to do that. She's absolutely right. One of the phrases I leave people with is, you know, add activists to your CV. Everybody, especially professionals, especially those of us who are privileged to have places in academia, to have voices in journalism, to have the space to talk, need to speak up for the pace of change that must now happen and take place every day. So climate isn't anymore about some faraway issue in the distant future that in 2100 we're going to reach a dangerous temperature. We're already across many of the danger threshold points. We already did not protect our vulnerable people from natural variability, you know, natural typhoons, hurricanes, before we even know that climate was an additional component, which it is. There is no such thing as natural weather anymore. Every single weather event that you see is now part and parcel of the anthropogenic forcing that we've not been able to control. And that's my sadness and my frustration, but also the source of my passion and strength, that we must now make good on the delay. We must stop seeing things as fixable on this 1-year cycle. We must stop seeing things as fixable through just maybe technical managerial approaches. And we must see and seek and put in place the solutions that are going to tackle the root causes of some of these systems. And on that front, I too am optimistic. I think what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years all around the world is a weaving together of many different movements. And you can see that very closely if you look here in the UK. It's not just Extinction Rebellion, it's also the Green New Deal sort of framing, the idea that we use this opportunity to fundamentally shift and reshape our economy, a bit like what happened in the aftermath of the Second World War, where the economy that went before the war was basically rejected as part and parcel of the way in which building back better would happen. And the sorts of leadership actually that had seen the war, you know, Churchill, for example, in this country, were voted out. So I think, even though, again, responding a little bit to what Rafe has said, there are these strong men, and they are men who are mainly pro-fossil fuel, pro-authority, anti-protest, anti-human rights. You know, many of them are in place, including, you know, just in India, for example. The UK isn't that far away from them. Trump, which we've just thankfully seen the back of. You name it, in Australia, Turkey, many other places, there was this ascendancy and turning to these traditional leaders who were aligned very closely with the business as usual agenda and aligned very closely with the fossil fuel agenda. And I feel that their time is over. They know that. The moment of reckoning is here. It's you know, why there's so much climate litigation. It's why there's litigation over in the streets that happening. There's street protests in all of these countries. There's you know, a huge clampdown that's happening across essentially even the Western world, what we like to call it, on the rights to protest. This is the biggest source of the protests that have been happening here in this country, because essentially the government is more or less outlawing protests, street protests, because they know that people have woken up. And I remain really, really hopeful for that. I think our young people are weaving together the deep-seated criticisms and that you know, are involved in essentially connecting the different movements that will challenge capitalism, imperialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and all of those things are happening on a scale and a speed which may not be fast enough to get rid of all of the additional risks that we're building into the system, but which I think are going to lead to a much kinder society globally and reshape geopolitics. So I wanted to say that, because although the goals that we set out in Paris, the well below 2 degree 1.5 goal, the net zero emissions by 2050 goal, which I sort of had a hand in, it seems that we are so far away from them. But actually, if you look and start to see where progress is happening, it's starting to happen very, very rapidly. And it gives me great confidence and hope that that is going to accelerate. It is going to accelerate, and it's only going to accelerate if we push for it in the streets, in the courts, in our academic institutions, if we hold our governments, every single one of them. There's no government that's done such a great job that it can't be held to account and pushed to do more. Every single government has failed its citizens and failed to respond to the known challenges. You know, they've had the science, they've had all of the people who are on this call, you know, telling them what needed to be done for decade after decade. So it's not like people were not on notice or this is some kind of new crisis. So they will be held to account. They are being held to account. The economy is shifting much faster. It's not shifting fast enough. We're still very annoyed. I'm very upset that the green recovery packages are still weighted so much more heavily. A couple of months ago, there was an analysis done, $205 billion dollars given to fossil fuel industries. This is global figures. 135 billion given to the clean energy sectors, greener. So we're not winning the battle yet on building back better, but the fact is that the economics of fossil fuel production, of coal and gas in particular, it's over. They are uneconomic, even on existing metrics, even without, you know, factoring in the social costs, the environmental costs, which are often neglected, and communities up and down the world are rejecting them, site by site, region by region, country by country, and that I think that sort of terror has sunk in finally into those industries. This week here we've had the IEA, the International Energy Agency report, which for the first time in its scenarios and analysis has factored in what it means to go to 1.5 degrees. And again, the 1.5 goal was something that the small islands that I've worked with for over 30 years, they put this goal forward along with the least developed countries and the smaller vulnerable countries back in 2009. This is when they put this goal forward. And one of the reasons why the Copenhagen conference, COP15 as it were, which I was there, you know, collapsed was we would not sign a 2 degree goal without referencing the 1.5 goal. This is in 2009. And so fast forward to Paris, and then the IPCC report on 1.5, which was mandated by the Paris Agreement. And you finally have an acceptance by the world's scientists, by the world's economists, by the world's thought leaders that actually 1.5 is the right goal. So it's taken 10 years to normalize 1.5, and the fact that the IEA now is also doing that analysis shows, you know, sometimes change takes that long. So again, like in time for Glasgow, what you hear Alok Sharma, who's the current president elect of the COP, he is repeatedly saying 1.5. He's saying the right things, and saying the right things is sometimes very, very important for us to say. So a corollary of that 1.5 shift is that my personal agenda and goals are to make 2030 the new 2050. So countries that are richer, have a historically large footprint, have the current capacity, they must phase out much quicker in this decade and make plans that are consistent with that. That means, you know, over 50% reductions, well over 50% reductions by 2030. Anything else is a failure. I'm saying that nature needs reparation. So reparation, the word reparation literally means healing. It means repair. And it also has this connotation of recognizing the damage that has been done and that must be made good. So nature needs reparations. That's my second big criteria. And I think that brings in what this COP is also going to deal with, the Conference of the Parties, Glasgow, this one, and the one coming up in Africa and Asia after that. They must deal with loss and damage. Loss and damage was a huge issue at Paris because, again, it was pushed by the vulnerable countries. It was pushed by, and it was a die-in-the-ditch issue for us. It was the die-in-the-ditch issue for the president and the minister that I was mandated to negotiate on behalf of, and they insisted in its inclusion as a headline thing. And again, the politics are complicated, but there has to be some recognition that loss and damage is happening on a huge scale, and that it's disproportionately impacting vulnerable communities, as is always the case, and that we must now put the needs of those vulnerable communities at the very forefront. We must center all our efforts around protecting the dignity, the lives, the rights that are hard-won gains over the past 100 years, all the human rights, and that we must do that first. So I think this framing of your conference, dignity and rights and inclusion, are, couldn't be more timely in terms of the way in which we see the climate crisis in the context of ongoing damage, in the context of historical damage, in the context of a system which really cannot function with the DNA fundamental reform. So 2030 is the new 2050. Nature needs reparations. And my sort of third framing, and what I'm personally working on, is community is the new COP. COVID has meant that we have not had the many international conferences, and that diplomacy has had to be done mainly online. And we're going to have this hybrid world probably for a long time to come, and that's a good thing. But we've also probably overinvested, I think, in the global and the national decision-making frameworks, and underinvested in our communities and where the everyday transition is happening. It's citizens now who have to decide whether they're going to give up car aspirations, whether they're going to build exactly the same kind of homes made of concrete and requiring huge amounts of air conditioning, or whether we're going to change the design of urban planning and our homes and our buildings to accommodate lower energy needs and more traditional building materials that are less energy consuming. We have to look at food. We are in all our countries shifting from traditional diets that were planet friendly to meat and dairy intensive diets, which are escalating health costs and resulting in heart disease and diabetic costs that are massively increasing, as well as not able to handle, epidemics and pandemics, as we've just seen in COVID times. So all of these things are linked. The fashion is as large a polluter as Russia. If you put together the emissions from global fashion, shoes and clothing, and the amount of waste that's generated when we chuck them away, those are all the things that are a focal point and involve everyday decision making by people. So I want to leave on a note in terms of my presentation that these are the right kinds of debates to have. I think that the way in which different movements, for example, the movement led by disabled people, they had a very simple motto: nothing about us without us. No decisions could be made, and that understanding, that simple demand, has at its heart dignity and the right to be heard, because no one is voiceless. Everyone has a voice. It's just that systemically, some voices, some constituencies, some geographies, the global south in some ways, has been excluded, marginalized, not heard, or not had their share of power. And that's I think, a moment of reckoning, which is happening now, which I can, yeah, I give you some courage and heart that in the global north, sitting here I am in London, our young people here, our movements here are really starting that deep homework. You know, every day there is decolonizing curriculum events going on. Every single subject is considering why we got to where we have. And that, I think, gives us a huge amount of hope to build a kinder, more compassionate, greener, fairer society. And I want to thank LUMS and the Office of Inclusion and all my guest fellow panelists. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Judge Shah, who's a big hero, and look forward to the questions and to the follow-up here. And if any of you are wanting or need some advice or are interested in following up on the COP side, on the climate change negotiation side, then please do reach out to me. And I, welcome, yeah, as a fellow Pakistani, especially to all my women who are watching. But hey, on any genders and non-genders, please do get in touch. So thank you very much. And
thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful insider's perspective, and also for sort of showing us the many ways in which the paradigm is in fact changing. One of the ways that the paradigm is changing is actually from the work that the courts are doing. So we are delighted to have our last speaker today, Justice Shah. Thank you.
Yes, hello, good evening, I guess. Hello to everybody. Thank you so much, LUMS, for inviting me, and thank you, Erin, for having me on the panel. I've really enjoyed all the presentations made earlier. I've learned a lot today, a number of interesting things. My presentation would be more focused on the right to dignity, actually. I thought and I'm very glad that the other presentations have already dealt with the effects of climate change, and there's a lot of data that's been shared by Rafi also, very interesting. And a very, very passionate presentation by Madam Patka from India. So what I'll do is I'll try to focus on dignity, as how the Supreme Court has been looking at dignity rights in the context of climate change as well as environment. And I like to come up with two proposals or two suggestions or two inputs, which how do I interpret right to dignity in the scheme of constitutional rights or the scheme of fundamental rights under the Constitution, and also that perhaps it's time to revisit this anthropogenic concept of human dignity and maybe expand it and take it to mean something like dignity of nature. So to which I'll come. So I have this note prepared, and don't mind if I just read through it, because I've just tried to put all my ideas together, so I'll just go through it. And I'll try to share how the Supreme Court in Pakistan is looking at this rather amazing right, which is, at the very beginning, let me flag, is an absolute right under our Constitution. All our fundamental rights are subject to law, whereas right to dignity is an absolute right, and there must be some wisdom behind it, to which I'll just come to. So at the core of human dignity is the autonomy of the individual will, recognizing man to be a free agent, possessing freedom of choice, the ability to develop their own personalities and determine their own fate. In the words of Professor Daly and May, and I continuously use their book, simply put, every person matters. No life is dispensable, disposable, or demeanable. Dignity is universal and intrinsic to a human being, so it matters less if the person is abled or differently abled, old or young, colored or white, has different sexual identity or sexual orientation, enjoys a high position in life or is unemployed and unsuccessful, is a criminal or a law-abiding citizen, is respected by the society or looked down upon by the others. Dignity of a person takes shape when he's just a fetus in the womb of his mother and lasts after death. Treatment meted out to a pregnant woman under the laws considers the dignity of the mother and the unborn child. Similarly, defiling the reputation of a person offends his dignity even after he's dead. In a recent case relating to employment law, our Supreme Court has held, fundamental right to dignity ensures that the reputation of a civil servant is not sullied or discredited through wrongful dismissal, termination, or reversion. The right to restore one's reputation is also a survivable right and flows down to the legal heirs to pursue and take to its logical conclusion. Any slur on the reputation of a civil servant impinges on his human dignity and weighs equally on the dignity and honor of his family. So dignity is the source from which all other human rights are derived, actually. For example, life imprisonment with no chance of early release due to sluggish justice system contradicts human dignity. Torture by investigation agencies contradicts human dignity. Forced labor infringes human dignity. Person living in the street with no home is a person whose human dignity is infringed. A person who goes hungry is a person whose human dignity is infringed. A person who has no access to basic medical care is a person whose human dignity is infringed. A person who's forced to live under humiliating conditions is a person whose human dignity is infringed. Article 14 of our Constitution states, the dignity of man shall be inviolable. It is an absolute right and cannot be abridged or curtailed by any law or interpretation. In this absoluteness lies its meaning for us. Human dignity is that basic humanness, that intrinsic worth which constitutes a human. Dignity is not conferred by law or the Constitution or the government of the day. It's not a title or an honor or an award, but the basic biological creation of having been born as a human. Anything short of human dignity would be inhuman and hence intolerable and impermissible to any society, in any society or constitution. Under our Constitution, right to human dignity sits as a crown on the fundamental rights. Purpose of the constitutional right to human dignity is to realize person's humanity, his free will, the freedom to shape his life and fulfill himself, a person's freedom to write his life story. Such vibrancy and vitality is the hallmark of living constitution in a democracy. Supreme Court of Pakistan, in a recent case dealing with rape, has held that past sexual history or conducting the two-finger test of a victim of rape is inter alia against human rights of the victim. And I just paraphrase a few lines from the judgment. Reporting sexual history of a rape survivor amounts to discrediting her independence, identity, autonomy, and free choice, thereby degrading her human worth and offending her dignity, guaranteed under Article 14 of the Constitution, which right to dignity under Article 14 of the Constitution is an absolute right and not subject to law. Human dignity hovers over all laws like a guardian angel, and I thank Erin for that. It underlies every norm of a just legal system and provides an ultimate justification for every legal rule. Therefore, right to dignity is the crown of fundamental rights under our Constitution and stands at the top, drawing its strength from all the fundamental rights under our Constitution, and yet standing alone and tall, making human worth and humanness of a person a far more fundamental a right than others, a right that is absolutely non-negotiable. So coming to the Constitution a little more, right to life and liberty, Article 9 of the Constitution, right to arrest and detention, Article 10, right to fair trial, Article 10A, prohibition of slavery or forced labor, Article 11, protection against retrospective punishment, Article 12, right to privacy, Article 14, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of information. All these fundamental rights read collectively constitute the essential elements of human dignity under our Constitution. And that's the point I want to underline, that an amalgam of all these fundamental rights is creating a structure for human dignity under our Constitution. And our Constitution is telling us that all these fundamental rights put together would make out the character of human dignity and define human dignity. All these fundamental rights are in fact the constituents of human dignity, These rights under the Constitution describe the qualities of humanness or human worth of a modern man under our Constitution. These constitutional elements of human dignity are not absolute and are subject to law. Right to life is subject to law, right to fair trial is subject to law, right to association and freedoms that I've just read are all subject to law, and this is the point that I want to make. This means that these rights can succumb to larger public interest if required. So a law can deprive a person of these fundamental rights and public interest, but it cannot deprive these fundamental rights of human dignity, which is inherent and intrinsic in each and every of these fundamental rights and cannot be taken away. The absoluteness of Article 4 runs deep into every other fundamental right. A person can be imprisoned for life, but cannot be kept incarcerated under inhuman conditions, solitary confinement, or where basic human necessities are not available. It will be for the courts to see and safeguard the fundamental rights are not sapped of human dignity. So the point that I'm trying to underline is that while we have fundamental rights, every fundamental right, even though it's subject to law, one thing cannot be taken out of a fundamental right is the right to dignity, which runs through all the fundamental rights and is an absolute right which cannot be taken away. So courts will increasingly over the years interpret right to life, right to privacy. They're all subject to law, but deep down inside is a right of dignity which cannot be taken away. So our courts have held that discrimination against any person on the basis of disability was a violation of inherent dignity and worth of human person. The use of terms or words like disabled, physically handicapped, and mentally retarded amounted to discrimination and offended right to be a person, thereby infringing constitutional guarantees of right to human dignity. The court, by application of the doctrine of severance, struck down words disabled, physically handicapped, and mentally retarded appearing in Disabled Persons Ordinance 1981 and held them to be violative of human dignity. In another case, the right to family life, this was a case relating to a Christian couple. In another case, the right to family life thus includes the right of individual to choose his partner and to establish a family with him. The basic human right to choose a spouse and to establish a family unit with that spouse is part of person's dignity. The court observed that impugned amendment in that particular law, which made available grounds for divorce under the United Kingdom Matrimonial Causes Act 1973, other than adultery, did not pass the test of minority rights, and in particular, the fundamental of right to dignity, and declared that particular provision unconstitutional. As a matter of background, the law in Pakistan, which was the Christian Divorce Act 1869, you could not divorce your spouse until and unless you could prove adultery. And that we thought was against human dignity, because that's not how the world works. And all over the world, the law has changed, and there are no fault divorces. And therefore, we interfered in this matter and struck down the law on the basis of dignity. So coming to climate change, we have a policy called the National Climate Change Policy, which points out that there is increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events in Pakistan, erratic monsoon rains causing frequent intensive floods and droughts. Then there is a glacial recession at the Hindu Kush Karakoram Himalayan glaciers, which is causing a huge inflows of water and leading to flooding. Rising temperatures resulting in enhanced heat and water stress conditions, particularly in arid and semi-arid regions, leading to reduced agricultural productivity, reduction of forest cover and adverse effect on plant species, increased intrusion of saline water in the Indus Delta, adversely affecting coastal agriculture, mangroves, and the breeding grounds of fish, threat to coastal areas due to projected sea level rise, increased cyclonic activity due to higher sea surface temperature. Now, this is according to the federal government's policy. These are the serious threats faced by Pakistan. So climate change will affect all of the essential aspects of a person's life, raising issues of water security, food security, health security, and energy security. With all these insecurities, a person's ability to design his own life plan is weakened, and his ability to make choices become difficult. Climate change can diminish individual and collective quality of life, and with it, the human dignity. So legal systems must appreciate three facts of life on earth. One, the unity of nature, the interdependence of all life. Human life is a part of nature, and that all life forms are intertwined. We now know that pesticides and other chemicals travel persistently through our waterways and the food chain into our bodies. Number two, the finitude of this planet. There are limits to the resources of this planet, and earthly finitude cannot be overcome with technology. And third, the limits of human knowledge. The system of life is so complex that anything we make or do affecting our physical surroundings not only may have unknown effects, but probably will have unknown effects, many of which will be adverse. Law, therefore, cannot promote the dignity of human life unless it also fosters and expresses the dignity of nature. Climate change will seriously affect food, water, health, energy, and security of people. These injustices could have been avoided if dignity of nature was respected much earlier. Dignity is a concept concerned with the superiority of humanity to the rest of nature. Western thought, from Cicero to Kant, is a deeply anthropogenic concept, anthropocentric concept, and one that seems to enforce a view of nature as of merely instrumental worth. Human dignity's inclusion in the UN Charter and the UDHR marked it as a concept concerned with both our shared humanity and our individual vulnerability. Human dignity was subsequently adopted into a range of international and domestic human rights instruments. Human dignity is now a fundamental constitutional value explicitly reflected in more than 160 constitutions and thousands of constitutional cases worldwide. In these contexts, human dignity becomes inextricably bound to assertions and claims about the nature of our humanness. Jeff Malpass proposes an approach to dignity that sees humans as embedded in and constituted by place. Dignity is now a complex and multifaceted concept, and one that is constituted over time by ways of a number of complementary contributions. This suggests that dignity might have a critical role to play in incorporating new kinds of self-understandings into legal adjudication. Human dignity is a concept that can accommodate understandings of humanness in which we are not only recognized as embedded in the world, but in which we are recognized as environmentally constituted. Stephen Wise contends that dignity rights be extended to all qualified to receive them, irrespective of their species. Dignity is often regarded as unalienable. In legal terms, this can mean different things: that the content of the protection is not modified according to the actions of the bearer, that human beings are not only the necessary bearers of this right, but that the status is unforfeitable, or that there are specific limits to any system of limitation. Dignity of nature, interestingly, appears to be a cross-disciplinary subject. There has been recent rise of new generation of environmental laws which reject the false dogma of human over nature and instead recognize our interconnectedness with the natural world and acknowledge its rights to exist, persist, maintain its vital cycles. The transition from an anthropocentric approach denoted by the right to the environment to a biocentric approach constructed around rights of nature is evident in various new legal documents. The Ecuadorian Constitution, certain Bolivian laws, and numerous ordinances of the US which incorporate and respect rights of nature and grant legal rights to natural world and enforcement rights to affected communities. These instruments steer us towards more robust and effective environmental laws. At the constitutional level, Ecuador was the first to recognize the right of nature. Article 71 talks of right to integral respect of nature, or Pachamama as they probably call it, where life is reproduced and occurs, has the right to integral respect for its existence and for the maintenance and regeneration of its life cycles, structure, functions, and evolutionary processes. The Swiss Constitution was amended to include a provision stipulating the account must be taken of the dignity of creation when handling animals, plants, and other organisms. This led to the Gene Technology Act of 2004 in Switzerland, which states that the dignity of creatures, animals, plants, and other life forms should be considered in any research. The Act allows, indeed encourages, rules and regulations to be based on the dignity of both humans and non-human species. The Superior Court of Brazil in case known as the wild parrot case observed that dignity should be reformulated to recognize an intrinsic value conferred to non-human sensitive beings whose moral status would be recognized and would share with the human beings the same moral community. Recently, in Han Cement case coming out of our Supreme Court, we've held that the environment needs to be protected in its own right. There is more to protecting nature than human-centered rights regime. We see elements of personalhood have now been ascribed to nature by legislatures and courts around the world. The approach of personifying the environment in order to protect and preserve nature and its objects is one of the latest revolutions in environmental law. Man and his environment each need to compromise for the better of both. And this peaceful coexistence requires that the law treats environmental objects as holders of legal rights. Finally, human dignity and environmental outcomes are inextricably intertwined. Attention to the needs of all these affected by environmental conditions evidences a respect for the equal dignity of all forms of life. Dignity may be the best metric for environmental health and climate justice. Moreover, the weakness of environmental laws, which stem in large part from the fact that legal systems treat the natural world as property that can be exploited and degraded, can be addressed by considering nature as an integral ecological partner with its own rights to exist and thrive. Human dignity is therefore incomplete. I underline, human dignity is therefore incomplete if it does not factor in dignity of nature. In upholding the dignity of nature, do we actually uphold human dignity? Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much for those very thoughtful comments about dignity that really brings a lot of this conversation together. I'm wondering if I can ask the participants on the panel to turn on their video so that we can sort of approximate a conversation for the next few minutes. And unfortunately, I think we lost the connection, or one of our participants had to leave. But we're delighted to be able to spend a few extra minutes with Farhana and Rafi and Sanval and Justice Shah. And one of the questions that that Angbeen would like me to ask you is actually about some takeaways. And some of you mentioned some of your takeaways and very specific points in your presentations. But for all of you, I'm wondering if you could think about what are some specific sort of action steps or principles that we collectively, and we as activists, we as people who are involved with this, and obviously centering around the LUMS Office of Inclusion, might articulate for a declaration that's dedicated to advancing dignity under law in the face of climate change. So that was a long question, but the short version of it is, if you could just articulate one or two principles that you would want people to sort of pay attention to and to adhere to as we continue to face these challenges. So maybe I'll start with Rafi, if you don't mind, because I think that your presentation sort of ended with some places to start.
Thank you. Amitav Ghosh has written this fantastic book called The Great Derangement, where he sort of posits if aliens came to Earth 300 years from now, when it's totally devastated because of the climate crisis, they would, like good tourists, probably want to go see the ruins, go see what sort of art human beings were producing at the time of the apocalypse. And yet he points out, if you look at popular culture, if you go to a cinema nowadays, if you turn on TV in the evening, absolutely nothing about climate change is being discussed. And so Ghosh posits that, these aliens would probably conclude that human beings were deranged. They had no knowledge of what was going on. But that's not the case, because human beings and nature have been entwined throughout history. So much of our culture is associated with nature. It used to form the basis of even the stories that we used to tell. So many of the stories of Northern European cities involve forests. So much of Punjabi poetry involves rivers. Nature was very much part and parcel of how we lived and expressed ourselves. And trying to understand what's happened between then and now really is this modernity and the Industrial Revolution, which has somehow taken the environment and put it as a backdrop to the story of individual humans being told. And I think the principle, the underlying principle should be somehow to bring nature back into the discussion. And I think Justice Shah was absolutely correct. We need to have constitutional interpretations that bring nature and the environment into the understanding of human dignity in our constitutional understanding. That would be my principle.
Thanks very much. Very, very thoughtful response. Sanval, maybe I'll turn to you next. For takeaways, 1 or 2 points of advice that might be articulated in a declaration.
Right, thank you. So I kind of have to approach this from my sort of own lens and base it on some of these economic arguments. I think part of I think the fact is that a lot of the discussion around climate change and policies have, if you look at the sort of bigger players like the US, China, perhaps India to some extent, the idea is on looking at, minimizing costs, not just of the regulatory environment, but also of technologies, right? And there's this, sort of great piece of literature which is kind of looking at this transitionary period, where, like, sure, if you're going from, if you're sort of moving to, let's say, a high percentage of electrification, in that transitionary period, people who cannot afford that sort of technology adoption, they're going to face higher prices of existing resources, and that's because the infrastructure for fossil fuels is still going to remain. Some people are still going to rely on that. Some people are still going to heat their, sort of use gas stoves and not electric stoves. They're going to use gas geysers instead of heat pumps, etc. And those are the predominantly folks who are not able to kind of afford that transition at that point. But they still have to pay for the base infrastructure. And then as people transition out, those prices actually increase, and not in a linear fashion, but in a very non-linear way, right? So there's this deep inequity, even in the transition to, let's say, which, sort of a net zero emission scenario. So if we are looking at policies, whether they be standards on carbon emissions, or whether you want to use price-based kind of, and there's a whole other story, right? There's new piece by Layout Stokes, who's a prof at UCSB, kind of argues that carbon prices are not really even functioning, right? And then, it's kind of like an article in support of the new Biden climate policy, basically saying you need stringent standards, you use those, but also you keep justice in the, at the forefront. Because with carbon prices, you're not getting the reductions that you want. Plus, there's this sort of, even if, places where states are engaging in carbon offset trading, there's this indirect impact on certain kinds of communities, right? So just to kind of summarize, what I'm trying to say is that, this fact that this transition to the net zero scenario or a low carbon scenario is also going to entail costs which are going to be distributed unevenly across the income distribution and across different communities. And so in terms of justice and dignity, we really need to kind of take that into account and make sure those are reflected in the kind of policies that we advocate.
Thank you very much. And I think that leads maybe well into Farhana's comments, and perhaps you could pick up from there and tell us your own suggestions.
Yeah, I guess using my own personal journey, I think it's really important each of us understands the discourse of our own lives. You know, what are our own assumptions? What are the big myths that we bought into? And that's something that we don't do very often. We don't question very much. So just again, just using myself as, you know, I came to this country, you know, my parents never went to university. I was the first child that went to university. I was a Muslim and a migrant and a woman. I was really into smashing glass ceilings and being a feminist. I set myself this metric: I'm going to earn more than my husband. I'm never going to be relying on my husband. You know, these are the things that informed my career, as was the assumption that I would use my law. I would speak legal truth to power. I would use my legal system as an advisor, as a strategist, as someone, you know, who helped give voice to others. And I think those assumptions are, you know, questioning your own assumptions, your own story is the biggest thing that you can do to contribute to justice. Because some of us make really arrogant assumptions about our own power. We don't reflect on our own power. We don't reflect on our own privilege. We think our disciplines, you know, whether they're law, not Percy Sandval, economics, you know, that people who are uneducated, those grassroots sort of activists over there, they're great. They can come around, protest and all the rest of it, but we don't give them the dignity and the recognition and understand what it means to be really committed to inclusion and equality. So I'm kind of, you know, part of a much bigger set of understandings myself, of questioning and understanding what discourse I fall into. There are lots of ways, and there's lots of wonderful writings actually about that. So many of us actually have a traditionalist, you know, myth that we bought into. We see maybe we see humans as the problem, you know, that nature was fine without us, and maybe it's going to be fine without us. You know, we're like the pests who cause all this problem. Many of us, you know, and this is, I think, across cultures, but I would be interested in knowing, you know, a survivalist mentality, and that speaks into this, you know, the survival of the fittest, or, you know, let's prepare for, you know, human beings are innately sort of bad. It's just a very thin layer of civilization veneer. You know, Humankind by Rutger Bregman, for example. It's a and you know, there are other ways of looking at, you know, are you a wizard? You know, do you think technology is mainly going to fix it? Are you on this paradigm? You know, are you part of this paradigm that we're all going to make progress and there's a bit of sacrifice and rubbish stuff that happens along the way, but broadly speaking, you're on this pathway to equilibrium and understanding and dignity? I don't think that anymore. I used to think that a lot. You know, and are you a prophet? You know, are you the prophet mindset? You know, you think that some great leader is going to come and, you know, give you the right moral sort of tonic and the right moral framework. So I kind of think that actually that's where some of the homework that each one of us needs to do to be a better ally, to be a better person, to be a creator and a participant both at the same time, in ways that respect, you know, so powerfully the dignity of everyone. You know, we can't do that if we are at the same time going around on a personal level, you know, sitting with our comfortable myths, our comfortable stories, our comfortable narratives, and not even aware of them. So that's what I would say is the most important ingredients, and that's what's shaping, I think, a lot of the very deep changes here. You know, calling out and telling people, hey, this is what white supremacy means in practice. You know, this is what patriarchy means in practice. This is the legacy of imperialism, is the structural inequality and the roles that we've been assigned. And so I feel like that's my little tuppence worth of advice, and that's much deeper than where do you stand on carbon taxes, or do you agree with carbon capture and storage, or, you know, should we, whatever. So I think those things are less important and put into perspective ourselves. At least that's the understanding in the part of the story that I'm in. You know, now as 56, you know, having done the best part of my career, you know, for over 30 years, I think, wow, I wish I'd had these understandings and questioned, you know, both my discipline, my commitment to it, my understanding of its role in shaping politics and the environment, and, you know, what I thought of as activism, you know, questioning that myself. So thank you. I'm going to have to leave at 3 o'clock, so I'm really sorry. So I'll hang on for a few minutes, but it's been such a pleasure, and hearing from you and connecting with, yeah, Pakistani colleagues. And I hope, as I said, if any of you make it over or are interested in virtual participation and, you know, you think I can be of use to you, please do reach out.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Farhana, after all this while.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Before we have to leave, we do want to hear from Justice Shah. Any thoughts, takeaways?
I realize that everybody's very tired and all that, so I'll be quick. I think the planet is going to find an answer. Nature will find an answer itself, with or without us. So that's for sure. Because this is perhaps the 6th extinction. I mean, there have been 5 extinctions before, and the planet will take care of itself. But the idea is to co-partner with nature and see if humankind could go along with this new arrangement. That should be the idea. As a judge, I get up and go to work and try to improve things as much as I can. And I think on an individual level, that I mean, I'm not in charge and I can't turn around things, but I can do whatever I can do. So if everybody could do their bit, that would certainly make a difference. And as a judge and as part of the judiciary, I would urge people to come to court, raise issues, let's debate and have dialogue and interfere, look into issues. The law schools should come up with new interpretations. They should assist the court on environmental laws, on climate change, and that's how we progress and grow. And that should be the role. It should be very active and such like dialogues. And I'm terribly pleased with the Office of Accessibility and Inclusion. I love the title, actually. We should have it in every institution in Pakistan. If there is a case that comes to me, I'll make sure every institution has an Office of Accessibility and Inclusion. It's an amazing title. And so all the best to everybody. I mean, let's all go out and do our bit, and that's all. Otherwise, rest assured, nature knows what to do, and nature will find an answer, with or without us. So thank you all.
Thank you all very much. I think we did answer some of the questions in the Q&A, so thank you for that. And thank you for everybody for your time and your very, very inspiring words. Take care. And there's another panel going on right now on dignity and campus. So we'll repair to that. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you. Yeah, bye. Bye.